Hey out there everybody, and welcome back to the second part of our Sam Barlow interview. So I hope you checked out the first part. If not, there will be a card up here where you can do so. Really good. Sam talks about his beginnings in the industry. He talks about his work for Climax Studios and also about his work on Silent Hill. And he had just started discussing Silent Hill Shattered Memories when that first episode ended. So this is a continuation of that. So as I say, if you haven't checked that out, please go do so now. And once again, thank you so much for checking out these videos, and a massive thank you to Sam for so much of his time. This is my first ever two-parter, but there was nothing I could leave out of it because everything this man says is pure gold, and he's an absolute gent. So yeah guys, enjoy the episode and thank you so much for coming. And if you do like what you see here, please hit the subscribe button and stick around because we've got a lot more stuff like this on the way. Thanks so much, and I'm not going to say what I always say because I say that at the end of the episode. But yeah, enjoy the episode, guys.
So that was like super interesting to me, was this idea that a game can take all this data and then as a storyteller, I can use it to calibrate my story, just as I would if I was sat opposite you and was improvising a story. Or the example I always give would be like stand-up comedy, right? If a stand-up comedy is touring, stand-up comedians touring their material, they've tested this material in clubs, and they have like the version of the show that's ready to go. But when they show up and they arrive in, I don't know, let's say they arrive in Leeds, they go out and they have the rough idea in their heads of what this material is, what the big jokes are. But to get everyone kind of warmed up, they might throw in a few jokes about the football game that just happened in Leeds, whatever, right? Or they might, like whenever a comedian came to Portsmouth when I lived there, they would always make a joke about Southampton because they knew that there was this rivalry. So there's these little calibrated things that are very, they're not clever, right? They're very straightforward. I will make a joke about the local sports team. I will make a joke about the local rivalry. Yeah. But then once the show started, they're doing their thing as a comedian where they're reading the room, right? So they tell a dirty joke and it doesn't go down great. So then they're like, okay, this audience doesn't like dirty jokes. I'm going to push this more and I'm going to tweak this thing that's coming. And you know, and they're listening to the laughter. They're getting this incredible real-time analog feedback and they're calibrating the whole show to make it, you know, of the moment. And that's why watching live comedy, there's alcohol involved as well, but like watching live comedy is very different to watching the Netflix special. Yes. And for me, that was something that games had never done, or not many examples of games having done, of like, we are interactive. We're getting so much information about our audience, individual members of our audience. Like the player is telling us what is interesting to them. Yeah. And so using that directly to tell a better story. Knowing that for Silent Hill Shattered Memories, we were telling one specific story, which was the story of this girl and her relationship with her father and how she was dealing with that or not dealing with it, her relationship with her mother. But at any given point, we knew we had to hit a certain beat, right? So at the start of the game, he's looking for his lost daughter. And at some point, he's going through this abandoned town. He sees a building with a light on. And that's hope that someone's going to help him, and he walks in, and some players would get the cop, they would get Sybil, and so then the question was like, how do we make this the most dramatically interesting version of this scene? Oh well, if some players have an expectation that authority figures will behave a certain way, we gave them this kind of more scuzzy cop that was not like, you know, they would walk in the room and be like, who would I want to see if my daughter is missing? I just crashed my car. A female police officer would be at the top of their list because this is an authority figure. They can call for help. They're going to be understanding and empathetic. And they sit down and they get this shitty, cynical cop that straight out accuses, I think, Harry of being drunk. Like, oh, that has taken the story in a different direction. And if we've read the player correctly and calibrated it, that's even better. Other players get this version of the cop where they walk in and it's like maybe they don't immediately love seeing cops, but they get this kind of Fargo version of a cop who's, you know, much more empathetic and personal, and it's not, you know, escalating in that way. So all these little decisions we're constantly making, and it's not that branching narrative thing of cause and effect cascading through these trees. It's very different to that. It's like every scene we're just shuffling it and tweaking it.
Yeah, it's what's happening in between that makes it, like, it's not necessarily what's happening in those moments. It's everything you've done leading up to the moments that.
Yeah, and you know, getting, you know, there is.
I mean,
in theory,
sorry, just like to use an example, like, I mean, I absolutely love Until Dawn. I think it's a phenomenal game. I love it. But Until Dawn is that more traditional style of, here's a question, left, right. Do you want to go down the path or do you want to do this? And then you get a branching narrative from that point, which then does cascade off, as you say. It's the butterfly effect scenario. But like, in Until Dawn, what you do in the moment necessarily doesn't, like, what you do as you're playing as the character doesn't necessarily affect what's coming next. Whereas in Shadow,
and I think
everything you did.
Yeah, and it's, you know, those the more interesting branching narratives often ask you to revel in the branchingness, right? Sometimes they're designed to have you replay something like 80 Days. It's a very different example, but 80 Days is designed that you will play it 30 or 40 times, right? And see different things, and it will feel like more of an adventure because you're making these choices and wildly different things happen. You know, there are branching games that are about kind of optimizing things. There are great things like there's an interactive fiction game called Photopea by Adam Kardrub, which the point of it is it's this interactive story and it's a tragedy, and spoilers, you can't avert the tragedy. Because it's interactive, you struggle and try to do that, but the game won't let it happen.
But it always leads you, yeah.
So there are definitely games that tell stories within this branching framework. But yeah, for me, the thing that I'd never seen that was fascinating to me was this idea of, you know, if you're going to shoot 3 versions of each scene, if you're going to have 10 times as much content as anyone ever sees, not to use that to give an impression of a cause and effect system, but just using it to create a unique and personal experience. Like, that was really exciting to me. So yeah, that's one of the things that made that game kind of interesting to make. And like I was saying, that I think the process of making that game, and it was interesting as well because the circumstances of this thing not being signed and the delay and some of the shenanigans meant that I had, I think, around like a 6-month period where I was designing this game without a team.
Yeah.
Which just doesn't happen. Certainly didn't happen in that era of making games for Climax. Like, you know, normally you would get a game greenlit off of a small document, and then it's go, and people are building stuff. You're writing the story as it's being made. You know, you hear stories like BioShock Infinite, where they threw out whole levels because the team had built them, and at that point, Ken Levine realized, actually, I don't need this for my story, or I've changed my story. But we had this wonderful situation that wasn't designed but just happened on Shattered Memories, where I had the ability to sit and on paper design this whole game, and so, you know, make it that it all made sense and that we had interesting ideas for how these things were going to fit together.
It's like having pre-production but in a game, which, as you say, in games, the films has a very traditional pre-production, production, post-production, but like games, as you say, it's kind of like hits the floor running and it's just, okay, come on, we gotta make this. Because everything's running parallel.
We use the excuse that a screenplay can't exist for games. I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly it doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
And there is no market for a screenplay. That what I love in theory about movies, because it's not always the case, but somebody can sit and write a screenplay, especially in the 80s, sit and write a screenplay over 2-3 years, you know, iterate, and it's this wonderfully focused expression, and then they can show it to someone and they can go, oh my god, this is an incredible movie, and they can be paid for it. And you know, your Joe Esterhaus, you can be paid very nicely for it, but someone will buy it, and then that document, and I love this from the stuff I've done with live action, like that document is now an incredible blueprint that loads of incredibly talented professionals can look at it and they know exactly what's happening. So, you know, everybody, when they shoot scene 4, everyone is looking at the same page, and they're all working to make that page come alive. And the director's job is to take that page and break it down and interpret it and explain it and work with the actors. But I love that that focus exists. I love that there is authoring, even though it's a collaborative medium. Yeah, there is a point where there is a process of authorship, and then everybody else is working with that. And usually in games, you don't have that. It is wildly collaborative. It's more complicated because we're inventing things as they happen. And, you know, but it's mostly business reasons that we have to work in this way. Yeah. Because if it takes, if it takes 5 years to make a GTA game, and if you're having to invent new tech every time, and if you're having to predict trends and work off of old trends, you just got to get it. Just got to get into it, right? Is I think what people assume. But I think we lose something like, when I had that opportunity on Shattered Memories to author, have an idea, author it, iterate it, look at it on paper, and I think when I say that I'm not sure it's true. You can't have a screenplay for video games, it can't be expressed on paper. It's the harshest judge of an idea is to have to put it on paper and it work on paper. Certainly, it might be possible that something that doesn't work on paper can be figured out when you get into it. But you know, if someone's going to shoot a comedy and no one's laughing at the script, you have an issue, right? No one's going to be like, I'm sure it'll be. And we see this with bad big budget movies where you're like, why did they go into production with that script? Like clearly this thing wasn't working. But I think the act of with Shattered Memories, like it has to work on paper, and you're already answering a lot of the questions that you're going to have to answer later. So that, and it was just incredibly helpful because when it came to make the game, everyone knew what they were doing. And if you were an artist working on a particular part of the game, you knew why that part existed, what came before it, what came after it, what the thematic linking of it was. Like a thing I was proud of at the time was the puzzles, and we never even called them puzzles because they weren't, but like the little interactions or set piece interactions or minimal kind of gatekeeping elements in that game. Every single one of them had to tie in to the story. There was nothing, there was no restore the power, find the key that was entirely devoid of
a narrative reasoning.
Like I found it funny at the time, but some big spoilers here for Shattered Memories. It's hard to get hold of the game, so it's fine.
Absolutely. Spoiler alert. So just in case there is anybody who doesn't want to, just fast forward 5 minutes. We're good.
So the big reveal at the ending of Shattered Memories is that the car crash that starts the game did not happen the way you see it happen, and that it's this pivotal moment in the life of what is revealed to be the true protagonist of the game. We made you go through about, I can't remember how many, but like 10 car crashes across the course of the game in differently abstracted ways. So there is a scene in the game, I think, where you are in a toy shop, and to get the key to get out of the toy shop, there is a toy train, and you can't reach it because it's in a case, but you can see the key is on the engine. So you have to make the train go around the track and crash it, and the train crashes, and then you can get access to the key. There is a scene where Harry is in a wheelchair and he ends up crashing in the wheelchair into a nightmare. There is a wonderful sequence that was very painful to implement where he's in a car that crashes into a frozen lake and then sinks, and he has to escape. But like, we just kept layering these things in, and the beauty of it is because you're playing a video game and you're inundated with information, and these things are puzzles, and so you're just getting on with it. You're not. Maybe if it was a movie, you'd be like, what's with the constant vehicle crashing? This is an obvious symbol, right? But because there's so much other stuff going on, you kind of just soak it up, and everything in that game was designed so that when you get to that final moment, you're ready for it. The biggest arguments I had, I remember, with some of the producers were, and they knew that like this was a twist ending or whatever, for want of a better word, and they would try and argue that like it should be a surprise to the player when they get to the twist ending, like it's all about the surprise. And I felt that as a storyteller, a twist only works if it makes sense in the moment.
Yeah.
Like if you have a twist and then you're like, hang on a minute, what? That isn't good, right?
I totally agree.
So yeah, the part of the thing you do is let people have the idea themselves at some point.
Yeah.
And then discount it so that they've already figured out that this thing is possible and makes sense. And then give it all the emotional weight so that when you have that payoff, all the things that have added up suddenly connect in your head and you have the emotional spark. The logic isn't getting in the way of the emotion because you've already had that thought, right? And I love mysteries and a good especially these kind of more tortured modern procedurals. I don't know, something like I remember the Killing, when they had the Danish Killing. I think it was The Killing. They pretty much in the first scene of that show you the person that's the ultimate murderer. And you totally call it. You're like, this person is dodgy as hell. Like, this is clearly someone dodgy. And then they have the detectives come in and they go off in a different direction. And so at this point, you're kind of screaming at them like, no, this person, it's clear it's this person. Halfway through the story, the detectives finally come around to your way of thinking. And you're like, finally. And they look into this dodgy person. They find some information. And you're like, yeah, I was right.
Yeah.
I got it. But then they find something that appears to disprove it, and they make you feel really bad that you've accused this innocent party. Yeah. So now your guilt over this, you repress it and push it back down, and so you repress that idea, and all the logic that you've already thought out goes away. So then at the very end of the killing, when it's the last minute twist, and you realize that it was that person all along, it doesn't make you go, huh? It makes you go, oh my God. Exactly. And you get all the emotional payoff and everything. So that was like a lot of the thinking with Shattered Memories was like every single thing you do in that game should be setting this reveal up, making it land properly, making it be interesting. And again, like it would have been impossible to do that if we'd made it like we'd made other games, like we made Origins. Like if we would just went along. And just the way you make games, right? I think it's still this case now, but like there's so much art to be created.
Yes.
If someone is building someone has to build a shop that you're going to walk through in a game that you're going to spend 30 seconds in, you will maybe pull out some photos of Google Maps or whatever and be like, it's this kind of shop, these colors, go. They'll go make it. And when they have to fill it full of detail, they're going to put a photo in of their pet. And they're going to probably, because the video game artists put a joke reference to Blade Runner or their favorite movie or whatever. They're going to fill it full of all this stuff, and sometimes it's fun Easter eggs. On that game, we had this rule where we were like, no bullshit. We were like, if you put something in there, it has to tie into these things, and we have to, because it will be part of the psychology system. It will be because I think a worse than an obvious symbol possibly is something that people think is a symbol or thinks has meaning or thinks is interesting that was accidental or was and is diluting the message. So that was a big part of being able to make that game in that way.
It's interesting what you said about the twist thing there, though, because that's something there's a film I do really like from the mid 2000s, a French horror film called Switchblade Romance, Haute Tension. But one thing that always pissed me off with that movie was that when it got to the twist of that movie, instead of going, oh my God, or like, immediately you start going, no, wait, that's not possible. 1 second. Like, the logic, as you said, kicks in that you're like, they have shown me something that tells me that this can't be the case. Like, as in... And so you can't buy it, so it makes you disconnect from it at that moment. That's what I always found with that movie. As much as I love the movie, whenever it got to that twist, I was always just like, oh, this is why this doesn't sit with me the whole way through. Whereas, as you say, I think the best used twists are the ones where you give the person that warm, fuzzy serotonin kick of, I knew it! I called it! And even if they didn't, they think they did. I mean, the example I'll use for that is stuff like Fight Club. The amount of people who were like, I knew it from the moment it started. It's like, did you though? Did you really? Or did you just believe, as soon as you heard the twist, you were like, yeah, I knew that. And
again, and I think it's interesting because people see it as a challenge, right? And if someone points to a movie and goes, oh, it was obvious, like that probably is the sign of a well-constructed movie, right? But yeah, everything, I remember we set it up so like the big reveal at the end, you've been in this first-person mode in that psychiatry room for like the whole game, and we put the door like right in front of you. So the whole of the game, there's this door to the room is sat there, so that when you come from the other side of that door, like as you click the door, you're half like, what you know something's about to happen, and then it cuts, and then the door opens and steps in, and you're like, oh, and it, but it's just setting up those peps, and definitely the super surprise crazy twist definitely does a thing, right? It is not valid, but I think you've got to think, what are you trying to do with your twist? Like, was the movie I quite like this. I like this. It had a tough act to follow because it was the sequel to Get Out, but the movie Us.
Oh, Us, yeah.
Right? A lot of the reviews I read for that, they were like, oh my God, once you've seen the twist, you've got to watch it a second time. And I did go and see it a second time because my wife didn't see it anyway. But for me, it was exactly the same movie the second time, because the movie was cleverly constructed so that when it explained what was happening, it made sense. You had lived through the movie and you'd had these little moments where it gave you hints or where it set things up. And in the moment where the reveal landed, those things all sparked and came together. So for me, the act of watching the movie a second time, I didn't change my allegiances. I didn't think less or more of someone. I think that's the difference, right? It's like Hitchcock used to make the distinction between shock, surprise, and suspense. And he would give the example of, you could have people sat around a dinner table talking for 5 minutes and a bomb goes off and they all die. That's very surprising, very shocking. The version where actually Hitchcock shows you there is a ticking bomb under the table and then you watch the conversation is suspenseful and it's interesting. And he would argue, and I would maybe agree, that it's more interesting.
Yeah.
And for me, it's all about information. It's giving the audience and their imagination information that can tick away and can make things more interesting. Because if the surprise version, you're withholding information. Yeah. And then you're going, ha-ha.
Yeah, and it's like, well, you never gave me the pieces to put this together, and then you expect me to be surprised by it. Yeah.
And for me, it's not even about the fairness, because it is cheating. You tricked us. Well done. Ha ha. Of course you tricked me. You're the storyteller. Yeah, you're in charge of everything I see. And I've definitely seen arguments that like The Sixth Sense is like that. But I
think The Sixth Sense does that thing we were talking about, though. It shows you, the reason I say this is, I'll give you a quick anecdote, that I watched The Sixth Sense with my dad, right? When it came out on DVD, I think. And my dad fell asleep. I didn't realize he'd fallen asleep. My dad fell asleep right after Bruce Willis's character got shot. Around less than 5 minutes into the movie. And so then he woke up later on, probably not too long from the end of the movie, and then went, yeah, of course he's a ghost, he just got shot. And I was like, what? And then I found out he'd fallen asleep. I was like, oh, you just kind of spoiled the whole movie for yourself. But that made me realize, I was like, no, wait, they did show us, they did give us that information to some extent of, and even in that movie, I think they're fairer, because that's one where when you rewatch it, you realize, oh, when I thought he was talking to his wife at the table, I realized he wasn't, you know. And with High Tension, Switchblade Romance is an example. I rewatched them and I go, no, you're legitimate. You're actually lying to me. You're actively lying to me. And speaking of which, actually, this is a great segue, because if we move to the other things you've done, like Her Story and Telling Lies, you move into that realm a little bit, but not in that you're lying to the player, because you give the player all the information that they could ever need. Definitely in Telling Lies, you give so much information, but it's up to the player to find as much as they want or need to figure stuff out. And to me, I think when you said earlier that somebody said it was an FMV game, I just think that that's such a disservice to them, because I understand, like you say, that they have full motion video in them, so you can obviously put them in a box and categorize them like that, but to me they're a new breed of games, just like movies like Searching and Unfriended are a new breed of movies that we haven't seen before. You could call them found footage, but are they? They're not found footage. Nobody finds the footage in Searching, you know what I mean? And so I'm just fascinated by these games, because, as I say, it's the abundance of information that you throw at the player that you kind of let them hang themselves with enough rope.
Well, yeah, and they came from that, like her story. So I had done Shattered Memories. After that, at some point, I was directing and writing a Legacy of Kain reboot, which we worked on for 3 years, and then it was cancelled. And it was like a very awkward time to be trying to make a AAA story-driven game in the industry, so we suffered for that, and it was transition between different console generations. But it was like having Shattered Memories to some extent was a smooth process. Like I said, I had that 6 months to think it through, because we had this slightly maverick producer at Konami at one point, and then he transitioned out. Like, we had freedom to just get on and make the thing, because it was for Wii, and we felt like there was this new audience for Wii. We had some freedom. Making Legacy of Kain, there was a lot more pressure. Some people wanted Uncharted. Some people, we felt we were trying to make a grown-up Zelda. We were doing some really interesting things with the story, but there were lots of pressures on us to, has to have 10 hours of visceral combat that makes teenage boys feel really badass. It needs to look a certain way. Like, it needs, at some point, we were told that our hub, if you think Soul Reaver, which was the game we were modeling ourselves on, like the emptiness of that hub, partly by design, partly because of the tech and the production at the time, is evocative, and we were trying to do that, but they were like, no, you need to cram it full of collectibles and gameplay. And there were all these pressures of what it is to try and make a AAA game, whilst we were trying to tell this interesting story. And coming out of that, and at some point deciding to go indie, I was like, well, I want to, maybe this will be the only indie game I make. But I basically realized I could afford, my wife was working, we had just got a small amount of money because my father-in-law had died, and it was judged that this was due, his health problems were due to asbestos exposure, a job he had previously. So they got this small payout, and we had this small amount of money. It was just enough that we looked at it and went, I could go and make an indie game for a year, and we wouldn't have to remortgage our house. Like, it's doable, and I'll only eat noodles. I felt like, the Shin Cup, I was half Shin Cup by the end of it. So I was like, if I'm only going to make one indie game, like, if this doesn't work and I go back to being a jobbing game designer, I should at least push as many things as I wanted. Like, I should make the most me thing. Like, if this is me without annoying producers telling me what I can and can't do, I should do the things I wanted to do. And like, one of the things that constantly annoyed me, especially with marketing people, was the assumption that the audience was stupid. The assumption that lowest common denominator ruled in video games, that you would always have to over-explain, that annoyed me, because I felt like every example I could think of, if you asked something of an audience, they would always meet you there. And I felt like the modern audience, especially with the kind of internet hive mind, was the cleverest, smartest audience we've ever had. Subtext was a thing I was very ferociously interested in. So when we were writing Legacy of Kain, I remember we would get feedback. There was one producer who would give us the feedback. He was like, I don't get this scene. Why doesn't the character just say what they're thinking? And we'd be like,
that's the most producer note I've ever.
You're like, that's the worst writing. He's like, there was literally a scene where, to not make it sound too simple, but like at some point a character, his wife has been killed. It's not as bad at fridging as it sounds, but and he's angry at somebody. And this producer was like, just have him scream, "You killed my wife, I hate you," or something. And it was like, no, that's bad. But we got into this argument where I was explaining like subtext is the lifeblood of storytelling and performance. And if you give an actor the line, "I love you," it will sound terrible, but you could have them say, "Pass me the salt," right? Like the cliche, you'd have them say, "Pass me the salt," and they could then put that into that line and that bit of business or whatever.
Yeah.
And they would push back and they'd be like, okay, we believe you, Sam. Maybe that's true with live action, but with CGI, where we don't have all the expressiveness, maybe we can't get that across. And at the time, my pushback was like, well, let's at least try. Because if we don't try, we have, it's kids' cartoon bullshit. So let's at least try. And this was a constant thing. So when I sat down to make her story, I was like, I want to make a video game that is all about the subtext. Because there's another thing as well that was argued, which was in a conventional video game, if I'm controlling the video game and if there's gameplay involved, then I need to be fully appraised. So you can't assume that I've absorbed the subtext, right? If in a bad story, a character would declare, "I'm going to go and kill the dragon." You might not need them to say that in a good story, but in a video game, the assumption was you've got to say, "I need to go kill the dragon," because the player might not realize that's their, and so every step along the way, you are being pushed to have the protagonist, especially, overly verbalize what's happening and what they need to do and what their wants are, right? Whereas good screenwriting, the character doesn't even know what they want.
Yes.
So I was determined to like go make a game where that was like the whole thing. So this idea of like respecting the audience, subtext, having made Silent Hill and just been interested in that space, having been obsessed with like immersive sims as a kid, I felt that the things you got out of an immersive 3D environment were tremendous, like the immersion, the sense of atmosphere, just the enjoyment of walking around in an environment. But I felt like maybe they were a prop to us as game designers. And you kind of see this now almost like I can buy Unity engine, can drop a character in with a flashlight and first-person controls, and it's immediately interesting and engaging, like just walking around, right? Exploring a 3D environment is engaging. And I felt like oftentimes, especially some of the more prominent games with stories, you have the cool exploratory 3D shit, and then you have a bunch of notes actually telling you the story. A bunch of audio logs actually imparting the information. So I set myself a challenge. I was like, well, what does a game look like if I don't have a 3D environment to walk around in? And I don't think I necessarily verbalized this as much, but I was kind of thinking along the lines of, you take a game like I'm really interested in some of the kind of trends of reductive game design, right? Of like taking, and we'd done this with Shattered Memories to some extent, and before it was even a phrase, I remember we had bosses telling us, this is just a walking simulator, that's dumb. But like you have a game like Gone Home, right, where they took BioShock and they just took the combat out and said, what's left? And it was still cool shit. It was walking around this 3D environment, very immersive, exploring, looking around, and discovering the notes.
Before that, even before that, you had like the sprinklings of that starting with Dear Esther as well.
Yeah.
Like Dear Esther was...
But I was interested looking at that, and I was like, there is a level where the thing that moved me in Gone Home was the voice acting of the person reading their diary, which I remember I was interested in because I think Steve Gaynor said that their original vision, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, said their original vision was very authentic. Like, you were literally just going to walk around this house and learn everything through looking and absorbing it in. And they knew that audio logs were a thing from BioShock that wouldn't make sense as much in this world. And they got to a point and the game was not generating emotion in the way they needed it to. And then they had this eureka moment of like, oh, when you read the diaries, which you're finding, let's have voice acting play out. It doesn't make sense. It's not diegetic, but that will give you the emotional edge. And so, I was thinking like there's probably a Radio 2 play version of Gone Home that is just those voice diaries. And I would be moved by it, and I would still react in the way I did. So I kind of had this idea of like, well, what would it be like if all the exploratory gameplay and the freedom you have in that aspect was applied directly to the audio logs, rather than audio logs be, this story content be little bits and pieces sprinkled around. What if I got to just get stuck in and have all this fun in that? And these seemed like very extreme ideas, which felt like a good thing. Like, I think I put cause and effect, especially working in interactivity. And I talked about like how Shattered Memories was not branching, was not cause and effect. So that was like a thing I was very interested in, was when you say I write interactive stories, everyone assumes cause and effect, branching narrative. And as well, like there's some very strong opinions about what even is a video game, right? And the idea that there has to be a systemic element, there has to be success and failure, there have to be these things built in. But I was intrigued because there are some games I've enjoyed. I get very excited if someone creates something where the cleverness is in the content, not in the system. Because what happens then is it's in the imagination of the player that the cleverness gets unpacked. So a good game would be like Riven, the second Myst game. It's quick time. It's Hypercard. It's like just a bunch essentially of images. Occasionally some movies play. There's a little bit of state tracking about whether levers have been pulled or not. But the really cool shit of the meta puzzle in that game, the lore of that world, is essentially just baked in to the drawings they made and the things they put on the screen, but it's not in the code, it's not in the system. And that's exciting for me because it's in your head. That, like, when I played Riven with my brothers, and we were like fairly stupid teenagers, I think, at the time, we solved the meta puzzle of Riven, and that was us sat talking about it, writing things down. And we had the idea of like, we think this is what's happening. And when the game confirmed it, we were like, oh my God, like that's so cool. So I love games where the cleverness is in the content, because I think that gives a lot over to the player, respects the player a lot. So that was kind of like my game design framework, and thinking around Her Story was like, I'm really interested in games and stories that have these interesting relationships between the game and the player. You don't just sit and get told a story. There's some back and forth, something adversarial. So this idea with Her Story, Her Story is a very opaque challenge to the play. You boot it up and it's beep beep, and it's just a boring ass computer desktop and a prompt with a word in it, and it's so opaque. It's almost like, come on, see what. And that to a human being is really enticing. It's like, oh, I'm going to figure this out. Like, I'm going to rise to the challenge. It's provocative.
Even down to the subconscious level of like, where like if you walked in and you found somebody's computer open, unlocked, you would want to just start going through all their files, because you'd want to know what, like, everybody's obsessed with kind of like finding out people's dirty little secrets. So like Her Story kind of encourages you to do that. It's like, go through all this person's files and find, and
it's it's how we do stuff now, right? Like, if I get, if someone replies to a tweet or something, I click on that profile picture. Who is this person that said this thing? and then I can Google their name, and then you go down this rabbit hole, and you're just constantly digging now. Like that's how information is presented to us, is this, you know, infinite amount of information that we can dig and pull little threads at, and that could be everything. Like the best reviews for me when people played Her Story is when they talked about going down the rabbit hole, because I think that is the thing. Like we can, and we all know, like you can lose an hour to just going down a rabbit hole on the internet, right? It's this natural curiosity. So I loved taking that energy and that inclination and using it for a contained story. Like this, you're not getting lost on the internet. It's like, it's all here. Like this is this box that is Her Story, that you're going to get something out of it.
Oh, definitely. But like, you know, something to jump back to what we were even speaking about a minute ago, something that I love about Her Story is that what we were talking about, the whole twist discussion we just had. Her Story opens with like a video, like one of the first videos that you watch, basically tells you what to, like, you basically get from it straight away. You're like, I'm pretty sure right out the gate I know exactly what's happening here. But as you say, then you kind of discount it, and then it's cleverly put together in the sense that, again, it does that thing of giving you a feeling of I'm really smart that I figured this out super quickly, but actually there's a lot more to unpack in here beyond a simple like saying I figured it out is kind of so untrue with that game, because there's so much to figure out.
I mean, I love Metroid games. I love the idea of sequence breaking. I love that oftentimes that when you play a Metroid game, you start to think you're sequence breaking, and then you're like, oh no, Nintendo knew I was going to do that. But it's what I think, yeah, both, I think Her Story and Telling Lies open in such a way that they lay out a lot to the player in terms of information without ever explicitly stating it.
Yeah.
So in Her Story, if you do follow the first search that's suggested to you, you get a bunch of clips, and you get actually the chronologically final clip of the whole series of interviews with this woman, where she says, blah, 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 speech by lawyer.
Speech by lawyer, yeah.
And then you get a clip from the very start when she's first talking to the police about what's happened with her husband. So the player instantly understands we're fucking around with chronology here.
Yeah.
Like, I've just seen the end of the story, and I've seen the start of the story. You see that she's wearing different outfits, so you grok like, oh, these are from different days, different things are being said. Just the tone of that final scene and how adversarial she's being is so different to the first one. So instantly, things are happening in your head, right? And then with Telling Lies, the first few clips you get, there's the one with Carrie's character, it drops you in and she says love you, and the clip ends. So instantly you're telling the player, we're not necessarily dropping you into the start of these clips. You know, you might be dropped in at the end of a scene and have to rewind to find out what was happening before it. You get dropped into I think Alex's scene. She's walking around this empty shop singing, pointing the camera out. So you realize, like, oh, there is all sorts of different kinds of footage here. This is not just talking heads. And the character that's speaking is off camera. You get dropped into, and she's singing a song. So it's like, oh, the words that are going to get sparked might not just be people laying facts out. Like, these might be lyrics or things that are said or overheard. You get dropped into Angela, and it's like, what? Why is there this cam girl there, and who's she talking to, and what's going on? And you get, I think you get a scene of Logan, apparently telling his story directly to the viewer, and you come to understand that who he's talking to and what he's actually saying is far more significant. But again, it's like, like I say, just giving people so much information that they can infer, giving them these little, and like I say, it's why I think a lot about Hitchcock is Hitchcock knew that the story he was telling was not the plot. It wasn't the dialogue in the characters' mouths. It was the information he gave to the audience.
Yeah.
And his whole shtick was knowing exactly what information to give you and when, so that you were anticipating, building up these ideas. And that to me is fascinating. And that is, kind of the structure of those games, which, and the big leap with Her Story that we carried on with was, for me, again, another thing that felt contrary to popular opinion was, we think of video games as being this medium where we show everything, you can do everything, see everything. If I play GTA, I can go to every single street corner in the city. Take a taxi ride in GTA, you can take the whole taxi ride. If I watch a TV show, it'll cut. Famously in TV shows, no one ever goes to the toilet.
Yeah.
Jack Bauer gets through multiple 24 hours without ever even thinking about it. But every video game worth its salt has a fully implemented toilet everywhere. Like Control, when I played through Control, I've never seen so many bathrooms in a video game. And you obviously are expected to be able to flush. You can open every cubicle, flush every toilet. Like, that's a very video gamey thing. And there's an assumption that, therefore, that's what video games are about. And the theory with Her Story was, if you have an engaged interactive audience, the more you take out actually gives more over to their imagination, and it becomes more powerful. So, Her Story was really about putting more and more weight on the player's own imagination, and proving, hopefully, that actually was more involving. It wasn't something that was going to distance players. It was actually going to make them lean in and make it feel more personal, more subjective.
Which it definitely did. And I'll tell you, I'm playing Telling Lies at the moment. Actually, I only just recently started it. And it's so funny because hearing you say, you could start with this one, you get these at the start. I'm like, I just picked the Logan, the David one. And that led me off a rabbit hole that I'm like, and then I found one of the it's the cam girl clips, and I was just like, what is this? And so then I started searching terms. I was like, straight away I found myself, I think as you say, the rewinding, fast forwarding, being able to pause a clip and highlight a word and use that keyword. I was like, in Her Story, I felt like a detective in the 90s. You know what I mean? And, as you're meant to, it's the era it's set in. Whereas, with Telling Lies, I feel like I'm a superhero. I feel like I have so much at my disposal to be able to, like, figure stuff out. But then, as I say, that's the rope you'll hang yourself with, because you have so much that you don't know what to do with it. That's my thing. I'm like halfway through a clip and I'm like, what is that keyword? That could be something super important, and it's probably not at all. But I have the ability to then search that up.
Yeah, that was the jump I wanted to make. The very facile comparison was like, if Her Story is Zelda: A Link to the Past, I wanted Telling Lies to feel more like Zelda: Breath of the Wild. It was like, my pitch to myself was like, having made it looking at Her Story, I loved that I'd created somehow a game about exploring video or exploring story. And I was like, what can I do more with that? So how do I expand exploration? How do I make it more open world, for want of a better word? And it was expanding the scope. And, what is, for me, playing those games or pretending to play them, like, there's an addictiveness to just how quickly you can stack up routes of inquiry and things that are interesting to you, which is what a good open world game like Zelda Breath of the Wild feels like to me. Breath of the Wild might say, walk over there. Like, this is it. Just walk over there, Sam, to that village over there. That's all we need you to do. Just go do that. Walk 5 minutes in that direction. 2 minutes in, I'm like, that bunch of trees over there looks interesting. Oh, is that a cave over there? Like, oh, why are there some seagulls? Oh, and like, you're just inundated with stuff curiosity wants you to embrace, and like, just that. And the thing that I loved about Breath of the Wild was I think unique. I think possibly unique amongst open world games in that when I played that game, there was a joy to walking through the world.
Yeah.
If I saw a distant, interesting feature on this mountain, walking to it and getting there and arriving at it in itself was a joyful thing.
Yep.
There was just a pleasure to exploring the world. Whereas so many open world games, like the exploring the world is just a means to an end to tick off some objective or something. And so what I was aiming for with Telling Lies was like just watching these people talk and be in and amongst them, and you show up their lives, and slowing the video down to absorb their facial expressions, just the equivalent. And this was definitely slightly marmitey to some people, but like for me, like the equivalent of walking a very long distance in Zelda would be scrubbing a long way through a video. But there's still some inherent joy in just watching these actors, watching these characters, being in their world, seeing the different textures of like being dropped into a video and being like, oh, it's Halloween. Oh, where are we? I haven't seen this location before. Like, who is this talking? What is this thing? What is the context? Like that in itself is inherently fun. And obviously there's a meta gameplay, which is you're trying to solve these mysteries and pursue lines of inquiry, but just, it should always be fun to just enjoy the video. Like the walking through the landscape in Zelda is the equivalent of watching the video with Telling Lies. And it was a different texture. Like the front page of the screenplay said, this is an anti-movie. And I remember Logan got very excited by that. But and I'd done it deliberately because I think her story got called an interactive movie, which always felt weird to me because a lot of what it was doing was very non-movie like. And with this one, I was like, if the player is in control, I can have an entirely different texture. There's a scene in Telling Lies that I think is 17 minutes long, and for most of it, Logan is just washing some dishes or something. And you couldn't do that. I mean, I think, were we shooting when this happened? Or I remember season 3 of Twin Peaks had a scene where someone had a brush and was brushing the floor for 4 minutes.
Yes.
Which was David Lynch having his fun. And it drove some people wild. They found it so painfully, upsettingly dull. But I think, I don't know how much David Lynch was trolling or just being David Lynch. And, he has interest in pacing in his movies.
Yes.
But I was like, I want to make something that is about filmed performance and just rolling camera on people that isn't cinematic. Like as a kid, I hung out in art galleries a lot, and that was the era of like video installations. You go see a Steve McQueen thing or Sam Taylor Wood, just these video installations. I remember being very impressed by 24 Hour Psycho, which was they took Psycho and slowed it down so it lasted 24 hours. But I loved that these things were entirely divorced from cinema, but there was an interesting quality to them. There's a piece by Sam Taylor Wood I was obsessed with of David Beckham sleeping. And it's just an hour of David Beckham sleeping. And so there's no narrative, there's no drama, but it's so intimate. And because nothing's happening, you lean closer even more.
Yeah,
it's
of course.
So intimate and weird. The act of watching someone sleep is itself like interesting. And I was like, I couldn't go and make a 5-hour movie that was all those things. It would be deathly boring. I mean, these things exist, right? And they're very niche. But this metaphor of a surveillance job, this metaphor of this is people being spied on and giving people control means that I can have that. I can have that 17-minute sequence. And if people want, they can exit that video. People want, they can scrub through it. But if you come to that video and you know what's happening in that character's life right now, it's actually interesting to watch them for 17 minutes and be like trying to get a read on how are they feeling, what are they thinking about, what are they about to do. And so I was really interested in this idea of, because people are more in control of what they're watching, how they watch it with this game, I could really push this very different texture. And there's some shit in there that was super excited to shoot. There's like, you know, a guy watching his daughter sleep, and you know, there's various stages of people watching each other sleep, or just playing hide and seek in the woods, just doing stuff like, and there's characters that are talking to each other that because they're comfortable with each other, they might, it's not like a rat-a-tat-tat movie conversation. Like they might take their time, they might pause.
Yeah.
There might be things that are implied. The shtick of telling lies, that you only see one side of a conversation, means
I love that.
There are whole swathes where you're just watching, say, was so chuffed to get Carrie Bichet in this thing.
Yes.
Because she's one of my favorite actresses. There are whole swathes of it where you can just sit and watch her character listening to her husband, and you don't hear what's being said, but you're projecting onto her, you're inferring from her performance, you're extracting subtext from just her face. Then when you go to the other side of the conversation, you're remembering it, bringing it like that. Was a big thing for me with Telling Lies, that was like a whole different kind of texture to explore. So that was like, yeah, that was an interesting game to kind of move on to after her story, of like finding these different ways to put even more questions onto the player.
Yeah.
You know, when you get dropped into a scene in Telling Lies, you're asking, who is this that I'm seeing? Where are they? What time is it? Who are they speaking to?
Where's the
what
other
just
part of
happened?
this
What's about to
conversation?
happen?
Yeah.
How does this fit into the meta story? Like, there's so, you know, we're asking so much more of you.
Yeah.
That you know, was interesting for me to explore. So yeah, we had lots of fun with that.
One thing though that fascinates me there is, one of the reasons that I picked the editor I did for a lot of my movies is that a lot of editors that I've worked with would say you've got to be on the character who's speaking, and that always went against my idea of, I like reaction shots. I think reaction shots are more important sometimes, much more important sometimes, than the person who's speaking, because the person who's speaking is already giving enough information by the fact that they're speaking. You can.
There's a great anecdote. I can't remember who it was. It's a famous actor, and he gets his first job in a big movie, and he's opposite some huge star. I don't know, let's say Kirk Douglas or something. I don't know. I think it was a British actor. And he shows up on set, and they're like blocking this scene out, and there's like a bunch of dialogue. And the famous actor is like, actually, he's like, why don't we give my lines to Todd, to this newbie Todd? Let me give him all my lines. Like, maybe it would make sense for his character to be doing this big exposition or something. And this young actor is like, oh my God, so generous of him that he's given me all of his lines. Like, oh my God, like how many lines you get is how you assess whether your character is important or not. This is amazing. So they shoot the scene. Movie comes out, goes to watch it, sits down. The scene starts. He starts his long exposition, and it cuts to the famous actor who's doing all the reacting, all the good acting, all the subtle acting, and the camera loves it, and it's on him for 90% of the scene, and the young actor's like, okay, he knew what the fuck he was doing, like that. And that's the thing, like I mean, it's funny because every now and then there's people get upset about how many lines a certain actor got, and they definitely have a point, but it annoys me because I'm like, actually, like, having lines doesn't necessarily mean you're an important character, whatever. But yeah, and I love, like, if I go to the theater, what is unique about the theater is everyone is on 24/7, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
You're not going to cut over here and miss this. So when I go to the theater, 99% of the time, and just what we were saying, if someone is speaking, someone has a big monologue, I'm going to look at the other. I dig this actor. I'm going to sit and watch what they're doing. Yeah, and that's always super interesting to me. Telling Lies was indulgent for somebody that loves that shit. Like that's
I had forgotten how much I loved the theater until I went and I saw a play. We were just about to we were in the middle of shooting The Parish, my second film, and the two of the actors that were in it were in a play in Dublin. Why can't I think of the name of the film or the play now? It's a famous play. Susan Sarandon was in it. It's harrowing, but Yeah, I can't think of the name of it though. But the two actors that were in it, they were in my movie, and I forgot how much I love theatre until I went to see it, because I forgot that they were the actors that were in my movie. I was so just like absorbed into their performances, to the point that one of the actors, Fiach, he had to like, there's a scene where he gets very physical with Lisa, like attacking her, and I had to physically put my hands under my ass, sit on them, because I was like, I want to rush the stage and throttle this dude, like just beat the crap out of him because I'm so angry. And I was like, that's because you've forgotten that that's Fiach, who's your friend, who you work with. Like, you actually think he's this horrible dickhead that he is in the piece, and that's why you cast him in your movie, because he's that good. But yeah, it really did. It reminded me of what I missed about theatre, because I hadn't gone in a long time. I think I'd put in my head that I didn't like theatre, and I don't know how that ever happened, but I'm glad that I reevaluated that.
I think the hard thing with theatre is like everything, it's business models, and it's like, who is the theatre for now?
Yeah.
Like the prices of the tickets and stuff, it naturally becomes for a narrower range of people, right? Because only so many people can go. The ticket prices are prohibitive. It's a challenge. But yeah, every now and then I'll go and see a good play, and it's just so electric. It's like seeing and casting Telling Lies was really interesting, because we were speaking to all these actors, and once they understood what this thing was and they read the script and saw that it was what I said it was, they all got really excited, and then they would like ask, like, well, how are you going to shoot this thing, right? If it's these cameras and people are talking to each other and these scenes, how are you going to shoot them? And I was explaining that, we had this whole setup where we were filming simultaneously in two places, and they were hooked up so that they would be able to see each other on screens, and they were genuinely acting, live against each other, and everything was done in one take, and they were all like, "Oh my god, this is so cool! This is like theater." And a lot of them were like, "I really love theater, and I love as an actor doing theater, but it means moving my family to Broadway for 6 months. This is a cool gig because I get to come and just do this and get all the." What is nice about theater is just being live and the back and forth with another actor, all of these things. And I think maybe it was Carrie said, like they'd come off shooting a big movie that was so heavily storyboarded and set up that like it felt like she was in a video game. Yeah. And then here she was shooting this video game that was like felt like the purest theater she'd done. That was just like this very pure acting.
It's because, as you say, they had to be like theater. They had to be on all the time. There was you couldn't go like, well, the camera's on the other person now. I'm not gonna. I know that this shot's gonna be used in the edit, so I'm gonna ease off. And it's like
just this, the setup, like, because it was important to me that if we were shooting in a room, a lot of the blocking was us just getting there and figuring out like, oh, where would you answer the phone if you've just been doing this and now your wife's calling? And then when you get a minute into the conversation and your wife drops this on you, and you need to show that this is, you're going to sit down and reorientate. And like, it was important to me that we just had this freedom to block things however felt, and they might change it in the moment. So it wasn't a conventional set because it needed to be dressed 360 degrees.
Yeah, of course.
We had to have ceilings. We couldn't have, film lights just off camera everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when we were shooting, like everyone disappeared. So you'd bring the actor in and sit them down. And, they had this weirdish rig that was attempting to replicate having a real device. And we'd call action. The crew would all leave, shut the door, and they'd just be sat in the location in character for 10 minutes opposite this other actor who's off somewhere else. And
another location.
You even had like Angela and we had this compound where we had a whole bunch of different buildings and stuff that were all the various locations. But like Angela, her cam girl setup was slightly further apart than the others, and so genuinely, like, she didn't necessarily bump into, like, she didn't see a lot of Logan. So then, like, when we got to lunch, she was kind of like, I feel like I shouldn't be sitting down and talking to Logan now, because like we have this genuine sense of not being in each other's space that is probably helpful. But it was, and it's interesting because we're doing so many things that are like not how you shoot TV or movies. And it's funny because when I started doing these things that are slightly more hybrid, I was willing to be very humble going into, working with an established film crew, because they know loads of shit that I do not know, right? So I was kind of expecting to walk in and be like, you just tell me what to do, and I'll talk to the actors and stuff. But just even on a technical level, because no one had done these things before, suddenly I realized like, because I'd conceived this in my head, I actually have a better handle of how we should tackle this and how these things should actually work. And we kind of, figuring a lot of stuff out along the way. But
in a weird way, like obviously not on the same level, and it's not AR, it's not, or it's not like a real world game, but in a weird way it kind of feels like your Kit Williams book story. Like Telling Lies feels like you've grown up to make your own Kit Williams story, and the kind of the whole point of her story or Telling Lies is the golden hair that you're trying to get to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, the idea of gameplay baked into the content, like, those Kit Williams books were static printed books that had gameplay in them, that had stuff that you would only obviously it's very puzzly, but the solution, I think there's a great quote, I don't know if he was quoting someone else or if this was coming from him, but Andrew Plotkin, I mentioned earlier, known as Zarf online, he was talking about a series of puzzles. It was a puzzle game that had like an elaborate kind of meta puzzle. And he said, like, the perfect puzzle is one that when you've come up with the solution, you instantly know it's right because it, is whole and cohesive in your head. But like that act of having the solution in your head and you instantly know it's right because it just sits, which, is what Kit Williams was doing. When the people finally solved it, they knew they'd solved it because they were like this, boom, it actually all adds up and makes sense. But I love that extracting stuff out of it and it feeling real to you, like having this thing I called out, I think maybe it's my GDC talk, but I was interested initially in mysteries and twists and detective stories and things because like the act of a normal detective story is you're kind of imagining and modeling the story in your head. And when you realize you are wrong, or there's a twist, or you realize that this new piece of information radically changes how you think of things, it doesn't break your immersion or your suspension of disbelief because what you kind of reboot your simulation. You're like, oh shit, I was wrong. I now need to accommodate this entirely different perspective. And so you kind of reboot the simulation afresh in your head and sort of redouble your efforts. So just these experiences where you're kind of letting people build up pictures of people, of stories, of events. And then as new information and context comes in, they twist and you reconfigure your solution or like your version in your head. Like it kind of creates this more real, more robust story.
I've just loved everything about this because I'm so into narrative and especially the creative mindset around narrative. Because obviously, I mean, as I say, I've worked in very, very minimally in interactive, game development, and now I work in linear storytelling in movies. But I just love all of this. But to kind of, as we start closing this out, you're currently working on Project A Redacted, or Project Ambrosia as it's being called. And I presume you can't talk too much about that considering that, like, bar the limited information that's already out there. But I guess for me, I'm very excited about that because it's presumably, it seems to have horror elements. It seems to be a horror infused game, which is right up my alley and right. But also, from what you've said about it, it sounds like it's going to expand on what you've done with Her Story, what you've done with Telling Lies.
Yeah, I think if there was a leap in like I say, that desire to figure out how much more exploratory can we make this thing, digging into the idea of exploring video, if that leap from Her Story into Telling Lies, and just in terms of the scale of the production as well, right, and the kind of richness of content and the cast and things, it's kind of that leap again. It's yeah, and I was really excited to bring in the horror elements because I love horror stuff. I love weird fiction. Obviously, that was a dream to work on that stuff with Silent Hill.
Yeah,
and I think when I talked about like the relationship between the story and the player and how that's interactive and how like Her Story and Telling Lies, while essentially being static content, create this relationship and this dialogue, and it becomes very personal. For me, throwing horror into the mix where I'm allowed to screw with you and where that relationship is even more pronounced, like, is exciting to me. It has a cinematic texture to it. I mean, I think it's possibly clear from the heavily redacted website. It's not just about looking like cinema, it's about cinema. I think part of it was like, people keep calling these things interactive movies, and like I said, we said on our script Telling Lies was an anti-movie.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'm gonna go make a movie then. I'm gonna do something that's about movies, and I'm gonna dig into what even is a movie, and the process. And so there's some really interesting stuff there. Like, it feels like everything I've ever been interested in my life is coming together in this game. Like, I was an obsessive cinephile when I was a teenager, obsessed with horror and like art cinema, and it's a game that I may be telling you too much now, so I have to kill you. But
this is
like one of the things that I wanted to do with most of my games is like, I love the books of Gene Wolfe, but he's too clever for me. So Gene Wolfe writes these books with incredibly clever structures or twists or revelations, but he's so damn clever, he'll put one clue in a 4,000-page novel, right? And he expects you will reread and reread his books you won't actually get the twist until you've read the book 3 times. Like, it's that level of cleverness. Yeah. And I love that shit. And when they're explained to me, I just love it. But what I've been trying to do with Her Story and Telling Lies, and this general thing I'm doing, is like, give people that experience, but make it not even necessarily easier, but like through these things being interactive and letting you absorb and replay and dig into things with a little bit more freedom to give you some of those layers of complexity that you get in a Gene Wolfe book, but in a way that's more palatable. You don't have to reread 4,000 pages of a novel 3 times to get the twist, because you can just jump to the thing, because you can rewatch the scene and get the context and all these things. So it's continuing to kind of play around with those ideas. It's super. I tried with Telling Lies, and I'm definitely trying again here to set things up where I feel like it could go horribly wrong. Like, when I made Her Story, it felt like a leap into the unknown. Some of the decisions I made with the design of Her Story felt risky, but in an exciting way. And I felt like I had the freedom to fail there, because what else was I going to do? It's slightly harder now when people know who you are and know your name and stuff. But this feels like it's there are some ambitious elements to it. There are some ideas that are so cool. Maybe a cruel God will stop it from working. But it's really exciting. We're doing. I mean, there's things I can't talk about yet.
Yeah, of course.
I told a few people just because I had to tell them that are really cool. That, I mean, like, fans of horror movies will be so excited about some things that I can't talk about. So it's
the great
really
thing is
cool.
Even you saying that is getting me excited. Like you saying that fans of horror will be excited is getting me excited about it.
We did some presentations to various platform holders last month, and it's fun. I mean, everyone has imposter syndrome, but as well, like I know that the things I make are weird, and they're not traditional video games. So every now and then, I'll just be like, oh, if I'm pitching to a traditional publisher or a Sony or whatever, like, oh, they're probably not going to be interested in this weird little thing. But when I explain some of the things that I can't explain to you, they all got so excited, and I was like, yeah, of course they're excited. Like, this is really cool. Yes, it's different and weird, but no, it's like super cool. So yeah, I mean, like the weird web page we have set up and stuff.
And the little video clips. The little video clips are enticing. Like,
and it's funny because it's one of the things I think when the game is done and out, you will be able to look back and be like, oh, he really was telling us very exactly what the game was. Even though it doesn't look like that. But it was important to me that, it's really hard to market these things. I think we made it really hard on ourselves for telling lies because so much, even like the nature of like what is Logan Marshall Green's job in that, it's something you figure out pretty quickly. But I really liked that the first 20 minutes plus, like people did discover that thing. Like there's, so I didn't want to talk about that too much, like in the press and stuff. So it was a hard one. I think this one will be easier because there's a lot more weird layers to it. But I just wanted to let the world know the thing existed, so we can start leading up to actually being a lot more explicit about what this thing is, and have some fun with it. And like Steam, we said to Steam, we're like, can we create like a screwed up Steam page which doesn't have any actual information, because they have their guidelines. It's like you must have 3 gameplay screenshots, it must do all these things, otherwise your page is invalid. And they were game. So we put it up, and then like the day we launched it and we had all this press interest, I suddenly got 30 emails, automated or semi-automated, from Steam saying your page has not been approved because it violates. There are no gameplay screenshots. There are no, all these things. And I was like, oh shit, they're going to pull the page. And then they were like, no, it's fine. They're like, we've pulled the override lever or whatever.
Gabe in the office has this big lever that he just puts.
But I'm having I remember there's, I think when I made Her Story, no one knew the game existed. Very few people, right? And I was on Twitter, and so I quite happily tweeted quite a lot of things that, in retrospect, tell you a lot about the game, or are interesting if you've played the game. But because no one cared, it was fine. So I'm trying to do that to some extent. So I'm tweeting a lot from like the company Twitter with lots of things that are inspirational and kind of part of the juices on this thing. And it's such a big, ambitious, weird thing that a lot of that isn't really that spoilery. There's a lot.
There's so much there that
about
it's only a tiny.
But, if anyone looks through that stuff and is like, oh, this is all the shit I like, then it's like, you're gonna really like this game.
I think this is that's a perfect way for me to mention that, like, obviously if you watched I presume if you've watched this 2-parter episode, there'll be links in the description to check out obviously Sam and the company website and the website for Project A Redacted, which is what I like calling it. I just
we didn't realize, like, when we did it, it was just a silly idea we had, and then at some point we realized, like, oh shit, people need to find this thing on the internet. And at some point it'll have its proper name and that'll be fine. But and it actually worked, like, because people were calling it Project A. Like, if you type Project A on Steam, you get it. And then we saw like a big spike because I think a game came out like, I don't know, Project Cars 3 maybe. We saw this big spike because people were typing project into Steam. And ours was coming up with this big weird eyeball, and they were like, "Oh, what's this thing?" So it worked out. We're lucky we didn't redact the whole thing.
But yeah, and as Sam's been saying, definitely check it out and see if it's your personal brand of weirdness. Because I get a feeling that it's from having Love Shattered Memories and Her Story, and currently really finding myself getting lost in Telling Lies. My only fear is that, like, as I say, like, if Telling Lies was 5 hours of footage that you could filter through, if this one's 30 hours, I could just be, this would be my Breath of the Wild of this type of, like, where I'd just be gone for weeks, months. Like, what are you doing in the shed, Paddy? Well, I'm scrubbing through footage, watching it, you know.
It's healthy.
Yeah. Isn't that what you always do in the shed, Paddy? But yeah, no, Sam, thank you so much. This is honestly, as I say, I will say as well that this is the first time in a while where I fielded a guest that I was able to just say something and then you ran with it. I obviously you've been doing this for a long time.
I warned you. I told you.
But I loved it.
Right?
I loved it because I often, and trust me, I just as much love the ones where I am engaging a lot more as well. But because just being able to listen and soak in and all the stuff you're saying is the type of stuff that fascinates and interests me about narratives. So it was a little bit like getting a big insight from somebody whose work I really admire. So thank you so much again for coming on and chatting to me. And everybody
thanks for having me in your coal shed.
Yep, welcome. You've been in my coal shed now. There we go.
Cool. So much zooming over the last 400 years or however long it's been.
Yeah,
it's cool to see a slightly different setup. So.
Well, Sam, thank you so much. And guys, as I was saying, check out all the links. If you haven't played Her Story or Telling Lies, check them out. I will also add Steam links for those because you should really, really play them. And that's it. As I say at the end of every episode, let's survive together and peace out. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thank you.